The morning fog lay thick over the rolling hills of rural Kentucky, muting the colors of the world into shades of gray and green. Thomas Harlan wiped the sweat from his brow, even though the air was cold and damp. He had been traveling for days on foot, preaching to small communities and offering solace to those who had little. His boots were caked in mud, his coat soaked from the previous night's rain. A faint smoke curl caught his eye in the distance. Through the mist, he spotted a small cabin perched against the edge of a dense forest. Stories in the nearby town had mentioned this place, a woman who took in travelers, though none had stayed for long. As Thomas approached, the wooden door creaked open before he could knock. A woman, thin and tall, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to pierce straight into his soul, greeted him. "You're far from the road," she said, voice soft but commanding. "Come in, or the storm will have your bones before nightfall." Thomas hesitated, a knot of unease forming in his chest. Yet the warmth of the cabin and her calm presence drew him inside. Inside, the cabin smelled of lavender, freshly baked bread, and wood smoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows along the walls. Martha moved with quiet efficiency, bringing a steaming bowl of soup and a loaf of bread. "You'll need this more than I will," she said with a faint smile. Her eyes, however, seemed to hide stories of sorrow and depth. Thomas ate slowly, feeling a sense of safety he hadn't known in days. She casually pointed to a shadowed door beneath the staircase. "That's the cellar. Holds my guests' keepsakes," she said. "You might want to see it someday." Thomas chuckled nervously. "Keepsakes? Like a wine cellar?" Martha's lips curved into a mysterious smile. "Something like that." As the storm raged outside, Thomas shared tales of his travels, villages untouched by modern life, families haunted by poverty, and lonely souls desperate for hope. Martha listened silently, her eyes never leaving his face. "You carry a gift," she said softly, almost reverently. "One that can reach places even I cannot. I envy your strength." Young man Thomas felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort. He had never met anyone who looked at his work with such understanding. He couldn't help but wonder what life had thrown at her to earn such wisdom. That night, the storm struck with a ferocity that rattled the cabin. Rain pelted the roof in sheets, and wind whipped the trees into frantic motion. Thomas, feeling uneasy despite Martha's hospitality, tried to sleep by the fire. Martha checked on him periodically, bringing extra blankets and offering a comforting presence. Yet Thomas sensed a tension behind her eyes, as if she were watching not the storm outside, but something inside him, measuring something intangible. Morning broke with a gray light spilling across the hills. Thomas, curiosity gnawing at him, asked about the cellar. Martha's face darkened slightly. "It's not for everyone," she said, carefully choosing her words. "Only those who truly need to be kept." Thomas frowned, unsure of what she meant. "Kept? As in imprisoned?" "No, not imprisoned," she corrected him. "Protected, preserved. You'll see if the time comes." Finally, Martha led Thomas to the cellar. The door creaked under her push, revealing a dimly lit space filled with shelves lined with trinkets, letters, shoes, and photographs. Each object seemed to hum with a silent story. "These belonged to people who sought shelter here," she explained. "Some have moved on, others needed more time." Thomas felt a chill. The items weren't merely possessions. They were remnants of lives paused, of pain suspended. "You keep people here? Like ghosts?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Martha shook her head. "Not like ghosts. More like seeds waiting to grow. They're given a chance to find themselves." Thomas's gaze traveled along the walls, where names were carved deeply into the wood. Each name had a story, and Martha shared some. A young soldier who refused to return to the battlefield after losing friends in a skirmish. A widow too afraid of society to leave the cabin after losing her husband. A runaway boy haunted by guilt for an accident that had injured his brother. They come seeking shelter from the world and sometimes from themselves, Martha said softly. The cellar doesn't trap them. It gives them a place to confront what they could never face outside. Thomas swallowed hard. The weight of her words settled deep in his chest. That evening, Martha confided in Thomas. She too had once been lost, trapped in grief after losing her only daughter to illness. Through desperation, she had discovered a method, one that allowed those in pain to pause, reflect, and heal in a place suspended from time. "It is not cruel," she said quietly, her hands trembling slightly. "It is merciful. Some people are not ready to face the world, but they need hope and a chance to be whole again." Thomas listened, torn between fear and awe. Could such a strange sanctuary truly save lives? Thomas struggled with unease. Was it ethical to hold people, even temporarily, in this cellar? What if someone never left? Yet he remembered the lonely miles he had walked, preaching to those who had no one. He thought of the people who could have benefited from a pause, a chance to breathe, to reflect. Maybe it's not cruel," he muttered to himself. "Maybe it's love in a form I don't yet understand." He watched Martha move around the cabin, her movements gentle, almost sacred. She wasn't a captor, she was a guardian. That night, Thomas heard faint whispers from the cellar. Shadows flickered under the dim candlelight. Curiosity and fear pulled him down the stairs. He found a man kneeling in the corner, murmuring prayers, hands trembling. Martha stood behind him quietly. "Some guests come in broken," she explained. "They cannot leave until they face what haunts them." Thomas felt a strange sense of calm, realizing the cellar wasn't a prison, it was a sanctuary. Those who entered confronted their own fears and pain in safety, emerging stronger and ready for the world outside. Days passed, and Thomas felt both comforted and uneasy in the cabin. One evening, Martha spoke softly, almost like issuing a challenge. "Thomas, I want you to spend a night in the cellar, truly alone, to understand what my guests endure and why I do what I do." Fear gnawed at him, but curiosity and respect for Martha's wisdom pushed him forward. The cellar was cool, its shadows stretching like long fingers. Thomas sat on a worn wooden stool, listening to the distant creaks and whispers of the objects around him. As he closed his eyes, memories he had buried for years began to surface. The families he had failed, the sermons that fell on deaf ears, the lonely souls he couldn't reach. A lump formed in his throat. He realized the cellar was not only a refuge for others, it demanded confrontation with oneself. By dawn he felt lighter, a strange clarity replacing the fear. Martha's secret was not cruelty. It was compassion, in its most intense and difficult form. Morning light filtered through the tiny cellar window. Thomas emerged, the fresh air feeling sharper, cleaner, almost like forgiveness. "You understand now," Martha said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It is not about control. It is about offering a pause, a chance to heal before facing the world again." Thomas nodded, tears welling. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. Martha's cellar was not a prison. It was a sanctuary of reflection, a place where lost souls could find themselves again. One afternoon, a young woman appeared at the cabin's door, shivering and frightened. She introduced herself as Lillian, a runaway seeking escape from an abusive home. Thomas immediately recognized the same fear in her eyes that he had felt upon his first arrival. Martha welcomed her warmly. "Sit by the fire, eat, rest. You're safe here." Over the next few days, Thomas and Lillian shared stories and laughter by the fire, and he realized the cabin had become more than a refuge. It was a cradle for human resilience, a place where people could rediscover courage and hope. As days turned into a week, Thomas watched Martha interact with Lillian and the other guests in subtle, gentle ways, offering reassurance, listening without judgment, and letting them speak their fears aloud. Each story shared by the guests seemed to lift a weight from their hearts. Thomas understood. The cellar's magic was not supernatural, it was profoundly human. It gave people space to face their fears, to grieve, and to grow. For Thomas, it was a lesson in compassion. True care requires patience, empathy, and trust. One morning, a letter arrived for Martha. Her brother was gravely ill, and it had been decades since they last spoke. For the first time in years, Martha hesitated. The cellar, the cabin, her purpose, it had defined her life. Leaving meant abandoning her sacred work. Thomas placed a comforting hand on hers. Sometimes, helping others means stepping into the world you've kept at a distance. Your brother needs you, Martha, and so do you. Martha's hands trembled as she held the letter. Fear, guilt, and longing collided. But she also felt the strength she had nurtured in her guests. Courage. Martha decided to journey to her brother, accompanied by Thomas and Lillian. Before they left, she opened the cellar doors to her guests. For a moment, silence reigned. The shadows of doubt and pain lingered, but something remarkable happened. The guests stepped forward voluntarily. It was not a forced freedom. It was a choice. The cellar had given them the tools to face the world outside, and they did so willingly. Martha's lesson was clear. Healing requires not only shelter and patience, but also trust in the resilience of those you help. The group traveled through misty hills and valleys dotted with wildflowers. Thomas watched Martha change with each passing mile. The burden of grief she had carried for decades began to lift, replaced with anticipation and hope. Lillian, too, grew stronger. She walked taller, spoke with more confidence, and laughed freely for the first time in years. The journey was more than a physical one. It was a metaphor for the emotional progress that the cellar had facilitated. Each step forward mirrored the growth and transformation that Martha's quiet compassion had sparked in those she sheltered. Finally, they arrived at Martha's brother's home. The reunion was raw and heartfelt. Tears, trembling hands, and hesitant laughter intertwined with apologies and forgiveness. Thomas realized that the cabin, the cellar, and Martha herself had prepared her for this moment. Her years of helping others navigate their pain had equipped her to face her own. The profound truth struck him. True compassion benefits the giver as much as the receiver. Returning to the cabin, Thomas and Lillian shared the story of Martha's unusual but extraordinary methods with the next travelers who sought refuge. The cabin, once a secret sanctuary, became a beacon of hope. The cellar remained, not as a trap, but as a haven where lost souls could pause, reflect, and rediscover themselves. The town whispered stories of the woman who kept guests forever, but those who truly understood recognized that it was not a curse, it was a blessing. Thomas realized that the moral was simple yet profound. Compassion, patience, and trust have the power to heal the deepest wounds. Years later, Thomas, now an elder preacher, returned to the cabin to find the cellar empty. Martha had passed quietly, leaving behind a journal filled with wisdom, guidance, and stories of those she had helped. He read her final words. The cellar never held anyone against their will. Every soul I kept was given the chance to free themselves from their own fears. The greatest gift is not shelter, but the courage to rise and live fully once more. Thomas closed the journal, tears streaming down his face. Martha had taught him, and all who came after her, that true compassion empowers others to heal, and that love is most profound when it gives freedom, guidance, and hope. The cabin remained, silent but alive, a testament to the human spirit. And Thomas knew her legacy would live on forever, in every heart she had touched.